I had been chasing those 4 cattle for the better part of 2 weeks, and every morning they vanished into the same tangle of creek brush like they had signed some private agreement to humiliate me. Jed Farley had warned me about them the last time he visited, standing by the corral with his enormous hands resting on the top rail. He said Henry's cattle had always drifted toward the creek in autumn because the brush stayed green longer than the upper pasture, and the trick was not to chase them, but to make the upper pasture more appealing than whatever they were eating down in the willows. So I spent a morning hauling the last of the summer hay to the north end of the property, spreading it in a line along the high ground where the grass had already gone thin and gold. Reverend watched me from the fence with his usual expression of tolerant disappointment, but when I swung up into the saddle and nudged him toward the creek, he went without argument, and that alone felt like progress. We found them where they always were, standing knee-deep in brush with their heads down, looking offended at being discovered. I swung wide to the east, keeping Reverend at a walk, and for once the horse seemed to understand what I was asking. He moved with a patience I had not earned, holding his line while I turned the first 2 heifers toward the opening in the brush, and when the bull decided to test us by cutting left, Reverend shifted beneath me without waiting for the rein. I felt his weight settle and his stride shorten, and the bull changed his mind. By the time I had all 4 of them climbing the slope toward the hayline, the sun was directly overhead, and my shirt was soaked through despite the October chill. Reverend blew hard through his nose as we crested the rise, and I leaned forward and put my hand flat on his neck. His ears flicked back toward me, and he did not move away from my touch. It was a small thing. It was the best thing that had happened to me since I came home. I sat in the saddle for a long while after that, watching the cattle spread out along the hay and lower their heads to eat. The valley stretched below me in long folds of gold and rust. The aspens, stripped nearly bare now, their white trunks catching the thin October light like bones laid clean by weather. Somewhere to the east, I could see the edge of the Dawson fence line and the dark shape of their barn roof, and beyond it, the ridge where Clara sometimes rode in the early morning. I did not look for her. I only noticed the ridge was empty.
That evening, I went looking for the ranch's land survey. My father had mentioned it once, weeks ago, in one of his clearer moments, when the creek boundary had come up and he wanted me to know where the Hale property ended and the Dawson property began. He said the survey was in his desk, the old roll top in the sitting room, and that I should familiarize myself with the lines before winter brought disputes the way it always did. I had meant to look for it sooner, but the cattle and the fence and the daily machinery of survival had pushed it down the list until now. The sitting room was dim and cold, the stove unlit since morning. My father's desk sat against the far wall, beneath the window that faced west toward the mountains. It was a heavy, handsome piece of furniture, walnut with brass fittings, and it looked out of place in the bare little room the way a man in a good suit would look out of place at a cattle auction. I rolled the top back, and the smell of old paper and cedar rose up like something disturbed from sleep. The survey was in the second drawer, folded into a leather case alongside a stack of tax receipts and a bill of sale for 6 head of cattle dated 1881. I set it aside and meant to close the drawer, but beneath the receipts was a bundle of envelopes tied with a length of brown twine, and the top envelope stopped me cold. It was addressed in my father's handwriting, careful and steady, the letters shaped with the deliberate hand of a man who had been taught penmanship as a boy and never abandoned it. The name on the envelope read, Mrs. M. Dawson. I sat down in the chair without deciding to sit. The cushion was flat and worn to the shape of a man who had spent years in it, and I could feel the impression of my father's weight beneath me like a ghost. The bundle held 7 envelopes, all addressed the same way, all sealed, all unsent.
The postmarks were blank. These letters had never left this desk. I untied the twine and held the first envelope in both hands. The paper was yellowed and soft at the edges, the kind of aging that takes a decade or more. I turned it over. The flap was sealed with wax that had gone dark and brittle. I did not open it.
Instead, I set it down and looked at the rest. Beneath the letters, flat against the bottom of the drawer, lay a photograph. It was small, no bigger than a playing card, printed on heavy paper and mounted on cardboard the way studio photographs were done. 3 people stood arm in arm in front of what looked like a wooden fence, squinting against bright sunlight. 2 young men and a woman between them. The man on the left I recognized, younger by 30 years, broader in the shoulders, with a full dark beard and a grin that showed teeth, but unmistakably my father. He looked like a man who had never once considered the possibility that the world might not go his way. The man on the right was tall and square-shouldered, clean-shaven, with a wide, honest face and the kind of easy confidence that comes from having grown up knowing exactly where you belong. I did not recognize him, but something about the way he stood, one hand on the fence rail behind the woman, made me think he was not a stranger to either of them. The woman stood between them with her chin lifted slightly and her eyes bright. She was beautiful, not in the way of parlor portraits, but in the way of someone who had just said something clever and was waiting to see if you caught it. Her hair was dark and pinned loosely, and she wore a dress with a high collar and narrow waist that did not look like anything I had seen in Elkridge. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that was not my father's, someone had written, T and H, the summer everything was possible, 1872. T and H, Thomas and Henry. I set the photograph down beside the letters and sat very still. The house was quiet around me. Through the wall I could hear my father's breathing, the slow, ragged rhythm that had become the clock by which I measured my evenings. The sitting room window showed nothing but dark glass and my own reflection. I picked up the first envelope again. Mrs. M. Dawson. M. The same initial that had signed the Shakespeare upstairs. The inscription I had found weeks ago in the storage room. For Henry who sees what others overlook. Signed only M, with a pressed wildflower inside, petals faded to the color of old honey. M. Dawson, Margaret Dawson, Clara's mother.
I did not open the letter. I was not sure I had the right. These were words my father had written and chosen not to send. And there is a difference between a thing a man says and a thing a man keeps to himself. But the weight of them in my hand felt like the weight of something I had been carrying without knowing it. A shape I could feel but not see. The way you feel a rock beneath the surface of a creek before your boot finds it. I retied the bundle with the same brown twine, set it back in the drawer, and placed the photograph on top. Then I closed the desk.
I sat on the porch for a long time that night. The cold had settled into the valley the way it does in late October. Not sharp, but deep. The kind of cold that finds the seams in your coat and stays. The stars were close and hard, and the mountains to the west were nothing but dark shapes cut from a darker sky. My hands were still warm from the satisfaction of the afternoon, from Reverend's neck under my palm and the cattle climbing the slope, and I did not want to let that warmth go. But the letters were there now, sitting in the desk behind me like something breathing. My father had written to Clara's mother, not once, but 7 times. He had sealed the letters and addressed them and then put them in a drawer and left them there for years unsent, like a man shouting into a well and listening for an echo that would never come. Whatever he had wanted to say to Margaret Dawson, he had wanted to say it badly enough to write it down, and not badly enough to let her read it. Or maybe too badly. Maybe the wanting was the reason they stayed in the desk. I thought about the photograph. My father grinning, Thomas Dawson with his hand on the fence rail, Margaret between them, chin lifted, eyes sharp and warm. The summer everything was possible. That was a sentence written by someone who knew that the possibility had ended. Across the valley, Clara's lamp was burning, a small warm glow, no bigger than a fingertip at arm's length, the same glow I had been watching from this porch for weeks without admitting that I watched for it. Clara Dawson, Margaret's daughter, reading by lamplight in a house built by the tall man in the photograph, and I was sitting on the porch of the house built by the man with the grin that no longer existed, holding the unsent words of a grief I was only beginning to understand the edges of. I was beginning to understand that silence could be its own kind of language, and my father had been speaking it for 30 years. The lamp burned. I watched it until the cold drove me inside, and when I pulled the door shut behind me, I left the desk closed, and the letters where they were, and the photograph face down on its cardboard backing. I was not ready for what was in those envelopes, not yet, but I knew now that they were there, and knowing changed the shape of every silence my father had ever kept.